All right, in this topic, we're going to be focusing on population ecology, looking at human population, animal plant populations, how they interact based on the ecology that they find or the environment that they find themselves in. So let's go ahead and get started with this. We know a population is defined as a specific type of organisms or organisms of the same species that are living in a particular area. So, like a population of elk found in Yellowstone National Park, or a population of bison found in the Great Plains. So we're talking about specific species of organisms that are living together in a specific area. How populations are distributed and how these populations get distributed are always going to be based on or influenced by abiotic and biotic factors within the environment. Okay, abiotic factor is any type of non-living part of the environment, so the amount of sunlight, the temperature or average temperature or climate in that area, um, the weather in the particular area, that's going to be considered abiotic, the amount of water available. Or biotic factors would be anything living in that particular area or in that particular habitat that can influence distribution, like the amount of food available. If there are bacteria, a bacteria that causes diseases. So anything that would be considered living would be biotic. So abiotic and biotic factors have a big influence on how populations distribute themselves uh, in a particular environment. But these are the three major types of distribution. You can have a population that is clumped, uniform, or random. A clumped population is where you have a group of individuals that are scattered about within a particular area. Uniform, which is going to be where they're more spread out uniformly. It's easy, no other way to say that one. And then random would be there's no really rhyme or reason how they get distributed, but they are, it's just happenstance how they get distributed within a particular area. So clumped, they kind of group together in small little groups, okay, as they get distributed in a particular area. Uniform, it's more evenly spread out. And then random, there's really no um, pattern to how a particular population will spread in a particular area. Now, there's four major factors that can affect the size of a population. Now, we've talked a little bit about populations when we looked at evolution, but we're going to get into more detail on how this works. Okay, so four major factors that control population size: the amount of births that occur within that population, or the natality rate, the amount of deaths that occur in that population, or the mortality rate, the number of species that immigrate into that population, and the number of species that emigrate or leave that population. So these are the big four factors that can control population size. So let's look at growth rate since we're talking about population growth. Our growth rate is going to be the number of births within that population minus the number of deaths. That'll give you the birth rate. Now you also want to factor in the number of individuals that enter the population versus the number of individuals that leave the population. But if you take out immigration and immigration, it's the birth rate minus the death rate. That'll give you your growth rate. Now when we look at a population growth, we can graph it, and then by looking at that graph we can determine what's happening with at a particular time within that population as far as how it's growing. So these are the four stages of growth within a population. You can have a lag phase, which is a slow growth. Doesn't look like there's a lot of growth occurring, but that might be very minimal or small amount. The growth phase, where you have fast growth, usually this would be exponential, okay, almost a vertical line on a graph. Stationary phase of a growth rate, where there'd be no growth, it's flatlined, if you will. And then the death phase of our growth rate, which would show that the population is decreasing. Okay, so we kind of got some terminology out of the way. Let's look at factors that can influence growth rate, factors that can influence those categories that can control a population size. The major factors that can do that are the amount of resources available and the type or the state of the environment that those populations are in. Now, why does this matter? If you look at just human population and the percentages of the amount of people per country and how it's growing, okay, we are setting at roughly 7 billion people on the planet. Okay, 7 billion people on the planet. Africa, Asia, Central America, even India are going to be the places where the largest amount of growth is occurring. China in particular. So you got China, Africa, India. Those are the big places that you're looking at. They have a higher growth rate at present than other places. North America, we hit our huge growth rate a long time ago, and we've kind of leveled out. And there are other places that are in decline. But what we're talking about is the fact that we've got 7 billion people on the planet. And certain scientists think that we've reached the limit of the amount of people that can safely be maintained on the planet. However, if you look at all those statistics, our population as a whole on the planet is still increasing about 1.5% per year. All right, so that means that if we're at 7 billion people right now, in 50 years, okay, you're going to be looking at double that. You're going to be looking at a population of roughly 15 billion people on the planet. Let's look at some factors that can influence population change. We've talked about the equation births minus deaths, but you've got to include immigration and emigration. Okay, some nice graphs you can look at of how birth rate is working. Now, let's skip ahead to the second part. The second part's really what I want to get to. All of those terms I just talked about, okay, we can graph a population growth, and it's usually represented by either a J curve, which is going to show rapid growth or exponential growth, or an S curve graph, which is going to represent a normal growth of a population that's influenced by its environment. Okay, and if you remember those stages of the growth rate, we have lag phase, where there's a very slow growth process occurring at the very beginning of the graph. You have the growth phase, where you have a rapid or almost vertical growth. Okay, and then you have the stationary phase, where it kind of levels out. And then this particular graph doesn't show it, but if it were to drop down, that would be your death phase. So there's a limit on this exponential growth, okay? And most of the time populations behave in this pattern, where they start out slow, they have a rapid growth, and eventually they level out. What causes this leveling out or populations to become balanced are limiting factors. Limiting factors that limit the size of a population. Nature has the ability to set factors, or these limits, these checks, if you will, to make sure that a population doesn't get too big. Okay? When a population goes through its initial growth and eventually levels out, what it's reaching at this leveling out stage, at the stationary phase of its growth, is the carrying capacity for that particular population of organisms. Carrying capacity is the limit that the environment that population is in, is the limit that population size can get and still be safely maintained by the environment. So no harm is going to come to the environment. Okay. Take for example, let's reference Yellowstone National Park. Okay. In Yellowstone, you have populations of wolves, and you also have population of elk and moose. There was a time when Yellowstone first started that overhunting of wolves occurred because farmers and ranchers did not like the wolves, hunting um, their herds that they had in the area, and so they pretty much hunted the wolves in Yellowstone to extinction. Okay, they killed them out, they wiped them out. Well, then over the next 50 years, in the life of Yellowstone, what happened was the wolf and moose population, or the moose and elk population within Yellowstone had no predators. So they had no checks by nature to make sure that their population didn't get too big. So they continued to get big and continued to get big. And what happened as a result is it had a negative impact on Yellowstone's environment. The elk and moose overgrazed on trees. The trees stopped growing because there was no old growth in the trees. No new trees could grow because the elk and the moose were eating the new trees. This destabilized the soils, especially along river banks and water reservoirs within Yellowstone. So the riverbeds just started drying up. Animals started leaving because there weren't trees to provide habitat for example, birds, squirrels. There weren't trees to provide a food source for beavers, who helped maintain quality water supply within Yellowstone. So it was a very negative impact on that population. Once wolves were reintroduced, they helped regulate the elk and moose population and bring them back to their carrying capacity for Yellowstone. And then Yellowstone's environment, its ecosystem, started to balance back out, started to regain its health. So that's the importance, an example of the importance of a carrying capacity and why populations need to be regulated by their environment. Okay, and it's not necessarily going to be a straight line either. If you look at this example, a population could peak, maybe gets bigger than what the amount of food available, or say the elk population peaked here, and then there were more food available for wolves to eat them, not enough food available for the elk to eat, and so they dropped a little bit, but then they got to the point to where there was excess food. So they came back up, but you notice that the line, the fluctuation stays very close to that carrying capacity line. Okay, I've mentioned limiting factors a couple times. So there's two categories of limiting factors. There's density independent limiting factors and density independent. Now what that means is limiting factors that are independent are limiting factors in nature that are not dependent on how big a population gets. So for example, floods are going to occur, wildfires are going to occur, earthquakes are going to occur no matter how big a population gets. Those are examples of density independent factors. On the other side of the coin, density dependent factors are going to be like food availability, okay, so famine, diseases that could spread. Those types of factors are dependent on how big the population gets. So those are the two major categories. Now, I've mentioned once again limiting factors a couple times. The big limiting factors, all right, is going to be competition for resources. So populations are going to compete over food, over water, space available, shelter for protection, mates within a particular population. Those are what organisms within a population will compete over, and those limiting factors are going to be set in place to make sure that population doesn't get too big. You have a couple of different types of populations that can occur. You've got case-selective and R-selective. Case-selective are just those types of populations that have organisms that have long lifespans, very small amounts of offspring, like humans, for example. Where R-selective populations would be animals like insects, that they live very short lifespans, but they have a lot of offspring. So that would be categorizing the different types of populations.